Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to our Lions Sunday Speaker Series. This is number six. And also welcome to everyone on Zoom. Hello. And of course to our speaker, Jim Irvine, right here. It is with great appreciation that we, the residents of Protection Island, acknowledge this land as the unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation and of their legacy throughout the land. Thanks to Emily, of course, for her hard work managing the Zoom setup. Donations last week of $226.85 went to NALT, and that is the Nanaimo Area Land Trust. This was asked for by Allison on her request, and NALT does a lot of land conservancy work here in the area. Allison also contributed to the fund as well, so that's why we have so much. Yeah, nice. This week, the donations will go to the PI Players, who are putting on a show in May, as many of you already know, and we're really excited about that. We don't have the exact date yet. This talk is being recorded for future listening. Emily will let us know when it's available in a few days. Questions, as far as questions go, Jim says he's happy to take questions during the actual presentation. Zoomers use the chat box or raise your hand so Emily can see it, and please mute yourself otherwise, unless you have a question. Our topic today is by Jim Irvine, everything you wanted to know about salmon except how to catch and cook them. I really wish you had talked about the cooking, but
We can do that one.
okay. Just a little bit about Jim now, and when I say a little bit, it's actually quite a lot, but it was also interesting. I couldn't stop. Jim was born.
Too many, chef. And I'm going to dogs and breed, so keep it brief,
Okay, here we go. All right. I'm just going to read this. Jim was born in Edmonton, Alberta. His dad was a doctor on the way to becoming a surgeon. So when he had completed his program, he moved the whole family to Dawson Creek, BC. This led the way for Jim to go to UBC, where he got his bachelor's and master's in zoology. He worked as a biologist then at BC Hydro for a while, and then had an opportunity to go to New Zealand, that's Dunedin on the South Island, for a PhD in zoology at Otago University. Jim was married to Linda, who announced she was pregnant, so it was a stressful time as they both had to quit their jobs and they moved to New Zealand on a student scholarship. They returned later with a degree and 2 children now. Jim applied for a job that his father-in-law had found in a newspaper. And of 102 applicants, Jim got the job. Now, that's pretty impressive. I really had to pry that out of him. For the remainder of his working career, Jim worked for federal fisheries in West Van, and then for about 35 years with federal fisheries at the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo as a stream ecologist. He's retired now, and he is a scientist emeritus. He says that means I work for free. However, it's an honor. Of the offers he received when he retired, he took a job with the Bonneville Power Authority that manages the dams on the Columbia River in the US. He gives advice on the salmon in the river there. He also was rehired by Fisheries and Oceans here, where he gives advice on issues on Vancouver Island. Jim has lived on Protection Island for 16 years. Please welcome Jim Irvine.
Thank you, Val. I didn't expect that much detail, but anyway, Sarah, my daughter Sarah is there. So she's the one that had to survive 4 years in New Zealand. She went down as a 6-month-old, and she's actually the only member of the family that's been back. We haven't been back. Thank you. Oh, good. So I can see myself. So that's good to know. Yeah. So so the title, I guess we can't get to. Can we get rid of that? I see. Okay. Anyway, what it says is everything you want to know about salmon except how to catch them or cook them. And these are sockeye salmon. And this is a picture taken by a good friend of mine, Greg Ruggiero. And sockeye are one of the more valuable species. They've kind of got a green head, most of them, and then a red body. So you can recognize sockeye. And I'm going to go through this, and I'm not going to read the text because I think everybody here can read. So I'll try to remember what the text says and just kind of speak around it. And as Bev said, I would rather this was interactive rather than a lecture. So I would encourage you to ask questions, or if there's something you don't understand, or if you want some more detail. If I don't know, I'll make it up. We'll just go for it. So this presentation is kind of an update of one that I gave 5 years ago. And and Jim, I think back there in the back row, remembers all of the slides. So I've actually changed a few of them, Jim. So I'm going to quiz you afterwards. But I like to think that that series in 2019 spawned this series. That was a joke. Anyway, so this is some of the stuff I'm going to cover, not necessarily in that order. And I'm going to have a whole bunch of what I find interesting facts. And so the downside for you is what's interesting to me may not be interesting to you, but anyway, tough luck about that. But you can anyway ask questions whenever you want. I'm quite happy to. Well, how did I get that? That's a very final slide. Oh, I see. I don't know. So of course, I guess I hit the. Yeah. Well, that was quick. Yeah. All right. So hit the.
There we go.
I hit this one, okay, and this one to go back. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we've been here. Yeah, so if you ask what's a salmon, if you go to Wikipedia, it'll give you this kind of salmon is a common name for fin-rayed fish, right? But the important thing about most salmon is they are what we call anadromous. So they start out their lives in fresh water. Then they spend a period of time in fresh water. Then they migrate to the ocean, where they spend most of their lives. Then they return to the rivers or the lakes. They spawn and they die. So anadromy means that they have this life cycle mixed, with fresh water and the ocean. So that's the. Hopefully I hit the right button. Yeah. So there's two genera. So human beings are Homo sapiens. So Homo is the genus name. Homo sapiens is the species name. With salmon, there's actually two genera. Atlantic salmon are in the genus Salmo, and Pacific salmon are in the genus Oncorhynchus. So they're quite different. So people that worry about these species interbreeding, there's no worry. They've even got different numbers of chromosomes. There's no way that they can interbreed. So that's something. And quite recently, steelhead and cutthroat trout were moved from Salmo to Oncorhynchus. So now these are actually salmon, but it's, even biologists call them trout, but they actually are a salmon. And it's introduced all sorts of complications. Like in Canada, the provinces usually have jurisdiction over trout, and the federal government has jurisdiction over salmon. Well, now the trout are salmon, and that kind of complicates things. So they haven't worked that out yet. Yes.
They can't crossbreed, but I don't know if this is true. I had heard that they can breed, but the eggs don't hatch, which would mean then that our salmon are mating for nothing.
Well, I don't know I don't know actually, but I would be surprised if the eggs would hatch because, like I say, they've got different numbers of chromosomes. So they are.
So the spawn is for nothing, basically.
Yeah, and they don't normally interbreed. I mean, the steelhead are closer to an Atlantic salmon, but the Atlantic salmon have escaped from different net pens, and they have actually colonized some rivers in northern Vancouver Island, but they've never been successful. And it's a little bit like if you've got a bunch of cattle and you let them loose, chances are they're not going to survive in the wild. the reason the province decided on having Atlantic salmon instead of Pacific salmon in the net pens is the Atlantic salmon, which were mostly from Scotland and Norway, had been raised in net pens for many fish generations. And so they are not, they're quite hardy. They can live in crowded conditions. They grow fast, so they're big fat fish, right? And so they're not well adapted for living in the wild. So anyway, when they do escape, it's highly unlikely that they would be successful. And not only that, the steelhead have a very similar freshwater life history. So it's unlikely that they would be able to outcompete steelhead. So the province in the early 1900s let loose hundreds of thousands of Atlantic salmon, including in our Cowichan River, in an attempt to establish them. I don't know why, but they never established. So I don't think it isn't really a concern, right? I can hit the same button. Yeah. So anyway, salmon can be big. So this top one is a Chinook, or called a spring salmon. They can be up over 100 pounds on occasion, but not often. And the lower one there is a pink salmon. And people kind of discourage pinks. Actually, my grandson caught pink salmon off the Kluxui in northern Vancouver Island, and it got him hooked on fishing, which is kind of cool. But you get them on a fly rod. I know I shouldn't talk about fishing, but anyway, they're a lot of fun on light gear, and they're much smaller. So that's kind of the range in size. It's from the Chinook to the pink salmon. And I thought at first this was fake news, but apparently so that's a big spring. It's a male. You can tell by the face, and that face with what we call the kype, that is, if you're trying to get a female, that's a really attractive looking face. So you'll see that most of the male, yeah. Well, I would guess that he's probably 7 or 8. So Chinook salmon can live longer than the other species. There's not many of these big guys left because the fisheries and the fishers, they like the big fish. So you don't get many of these big guys anymore. Yeah.
Is their cycle different then? So they don't spawn as often, or can they go through 2 cycles?
I'm going to go through the life cycle in a minute, but they basically all die after spawning. The Pacific salmon, the Atlantic salmon is different. It can spawn again, as can steelhead and cutthroat. Yeah. So I like to show this slide because this is a coho salmon in the Millstone, and Doug Vander Kirchhoff, who works here, and I think he and Dot still live on the island. Anyway, he was the guy that built the spawning channel. Like, he operated the machine, which is kind of cool. And we're quite lucky in Nanaimo because we've got the Nanaimo River right here has major runs of chum salmon, also Chinook and coho. The Nanaimo and the Chase River and the Cat Stream is a tributary to the Chase. And I remember working in the Cat Stream years ago, and it flows through people's backyards. And I remember a bunch of neighbors coming out, and they were just amazed. We were catching these coho salmon, and they've lived there for 30 years. They didn't know coho salmon were in Cat Stream, but they get almost up to the high school and getting up towards the college there. Millstone. Well, this is the Millstone. So the fishway or the side channel that was built there was to enable the coho to get up beyond it wasn't really a blockage, but it was a hindrance for migration. So we're quite lucky. And Departure Bay Creek has occasional coho in it. So we're lucky that we have as many salmon as we do. So this is a rather generalized life cycle. This is for sockeye. But let's see, I think I've got a mouse. Oops. I shouldn't use the mouse, I'll lose it. Anyway, it's a circle. So a circle can start at any point. But if you start where the eggs are being laid, you'll see can I do this? Yeah, there we are. So that's a pair of spawners. so the female does most of the work. And so she will be largely in charge of building the red, which is the nest. And so she'll work gravel upstream of where she wants, actually where she wants the nest to be. And with her tail, she'll kind of stir it up and the current will move the rocks down. And then when they go to spawn, usually some species will pair up, others it's more like group sex, I guess, and they kind of all get together and they'll do their thing in the red. And then typically the male goes off looking for another female. And the female goes upstream of this little depression and she will again stir over the rocks upstream of the nest. And then the gravel will move down and cover the nest. And so it's typically in the fall. So the adults all die. Actually, the Pacific salmon all die after spawning. They'll spend a certain time, well, the eggs will hatch out in early January, February typically, and then they turn into alevins, which has got the yolk sac. When the yolk sac is almost all absorbed, they'll swim up through the gravel to the surface of this gravel and live in the stream for anywhere from a day to 2 or 3 years, depending on the species. Then they go to the ocean. And again, depending on the species, they'll stay close or they'll migrate a long ways away. And then they'll return to the river and have to find their river and find their spawning area and do it all again. So quite an amazing life cycle, I think. Lots of interesting things like how do they find their way? Yep, Jim.
On a particular river they left from.
Well, they don't. A lot of them don't. So with the chum and the pink, I always say that they return to areas of coastline rather than individual rivers, so that the chum and the pink have their fry will hatch out and migrate to the ocean right away. So their homing is less developed, but that is a survival strategy because it means they don't put all the eggs in one basket kind of thing. They spread them out. Sockeye are the most precise, and they will almost invariably return to the lake that the juveniles lived in. And so in BC, we have over 100 genetically distinct populations of sockeye salmon, which makes because they're not breeding with sockeye from other lakes. So it makes them quite different. So basically, amongst the different species, they have a range of life history types, which enable them to take advantage of different opportunities, if you like. Does that make sense or answer the question? Yeah. Yeah, so Pacific salmon apparently diverged from Atlantic salmon 15 million years ago. So that's a long time. So we're quite lucky. So these are what are interpreted to be salmon. So this is from Petroglyph Park. And you can see, if you haven't been to Petroglyph Park, it's been vandalized. It's not quite as nice as it probably was 50 years ago, but it's worth stopping if you haven't stopped, just to see the remains of the etchings on the rocks. So, and there's lots of other ones. Yep.
Useful. Haven't they done research?
Well, that's a good question. I think about that. Well, it says approximately. That's what that is. We don't that, but it's well, you can basically what you can do is you can look at the rates of gene mutation, and so you've got the two of them. There's some commonality, and you can basically, I don't know how they do this, but they can basically determine at what point they come from a common ancestor. And so they can determine at what point it's likely that these two species diverged, or two genera diverged from the common species. But it's approximate, maybe it's 12 million, maybe it's 20, I don't know, but it's a long time ago, right? But the whole field of genetics has just taken off in the last 10 years. The stuff I took in genetics is, way out of date.
So it's not.
No, not from, well, as far as I know, no. I mean, they do have lots of records from the fossils and more often from sediment in lakes. And so the hard parts from the fish, well, the fish will maybe die in the lake. The hard parts will settle down and not decompose. And then they can, they'll discover things like fish otoliths, ear bones, or even scales, and they can date when the fish were there based on the age of the sediment, which they can figure out. So, yeah. So you talk a little bit about the ocean, because that's my main interest, is sort of what's going on in the ocean. And so this is called a sea surface temperature anomaly plot. And an anomaly is describes deviations from long-term means at a particular location. So what that means is you see this bright red spot, which is kind of off Oregon, California, that temperature there in the center of that red blob would be, I believe, about 4 degrees centigrade higher than the average temperature at that location and that time of year, historically. And then you can see along the equator that that's a classic El Nino signal. When you get the hot weather, the hot water right along the equator. So scientists can use this kind of information to predict things like La Ninas and El Ninos, which are kind of the opposite. But the point here is that, so the green, I believe, this doesn't have a scale on it, but I believe the green is sort of a half a degree warmer than normal. And the yellow is like a degree, and then the red goes up to 3. So most of the eastern North Pacific, where our salmon live, has been much warmer than historically. And you can see off of Bristol Bay, up in southeast Alaska there, it's actually colder. So that might be good for the fish up there. So the way it works is salmon they're cold water species, so they like cold water. And our salmon are, I've got a later slide that'll show the distribution, but basically what it means is that because they're a cold water species, the populations that are near the southern extent of their distribution, as the water gets warmer, they tend to die off. Whereas the species that are further north, some of them are up in the Arctic and it's too cold for them to their optimal temperature. Well, things are getting better for them. So the northern species are doing better relative to the southern species and populations. And not much you can do about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the distribution. So these are Chinook salmon. We'll get into how to tell the species. So this is a map of the historical distribution of salmon in the North Pacific. And the green shows the extent of freshwater distribution, and the blue shows the ocean. And so the first thing I'll say is that a lot of them mix together, right? Because they don't know where the boundaries are. And so our salmon that are mostly in the Gulf of Alaska, if I can do this without advancing it. Yeah, so that's the Gulf of Alaska here. So most of our salmon end up there, and they actually coexist there with a lot of Asian salmon, particularly the chum salmon that start out from Russia and Japan. They start out in the Sea of Okhotsk, and then they move to the Bering Sea. And then, like a lot of animals, they go south in the winter, and they go south to the Gulf of Alaska. So they're interested. So our fish are actually sharing the same ecosystem as a lot of the salmon, not only from Alaska, but from Asia. So it's kind of interesting. So this map shows their distribution down right into Baja California. I don't think there's any left there now. And this is not, it doesn't show abundance. It's just distribution. So you can see that, well, a couple of things. One is that here we are. Let's see, there's Protection Island. It's kind of hard to see it, but it's like right there. It's not very big, is it? Anyway, there. That's Protection Island. So we are near the southern extent of the salmon distribution. So what does that tell you about what's happening with climate change, right? So we're losing fish, but it depends on the species. Alaska is generally Alaska and this area of Russia. They're kind of geographically the climate change winners, if you like. But we've got salmon going right up into the Arctic. And here I have to show you this. This is the Mackenzie, and this is the Liard right here. So this is my first claim to fame in salmon biology. As a young biologist with BC Hydro, I discovered a run of chum salmon in the Liard in northern BC. And I'm not sure the engineers really appreciated that, but there are no dams on the Liard now. So that's might have something to do with it. But anyway, yeah, so anyway, they do, so they mix in the ocean and but they're widely distributed. Also, this is one. Now, Jim wanted to know about this one. So when I gave this talk 5 years ago, I just come back from Norway, where they actually brought me there because I know something about pink salmon, and so I knew Jim was going to be here, so I can provide a slight update on this, and so it's quite interesting. So pink salmon or Pacific salmon, they don't live in the Atlantic, right? Well, they do now, and oops, oh dear, I did that again, didn't I? These buttons are awfully close together. Oh, yes. So this, when Sarah and I lived in New Zealand, you'd go to a store where you'd buy a map, and often they'd have New Zealand at the top of the world. Like the Earth is just a big ball that kind of rotates around, right? And there is no up or down, right? So anyway, what I did here is I took a Google Earth image trying to look down on the North Pole. So that's what you see is kind of the idea. And so there's Nanaimo's over here, Protection Island is about there, and Seattle just for reference. And so what the Russians did is they took fish from this owner. I guess I don't want to stop share, do I? Anyway, they took pink salmon from the River Ona. Oops. What did I do? Anyway, and they moved them to eastern. I think I'll give up on the mouse. They moved them to far western Russia, and there was basically no salmon that anybody knew about on that whole stretch of Russia. It's just about similar kind of area as northern Canada. So they moved them there, and meanwhile the ocean was getting warmer. And after about 15 years, these pink salmon took hold, and they are now very abundant in Norway in particular. So there's tens of thousands of pink salmon returning to northern Norway, and these are Pacific salmon, right? They appear to have colonized Scotland, so they've actually caught pink salmon fry leaving from streams in Scotland. They've been found in Iceland. They've been found in Greenland. And there was one caught in Clyde River there a few years ago in the Canadian Arctic, and a bunch have turned up in Labrador. So it's kind of interesting, because these are Pacific salmon were coming back towards the Pacific via the Atlantic. And there's no indication that they're actually successfully spawning in Arctic Canada or Labrador, but who knows what will happen if you give them enough time. So it's kind of interesting that they've moved that way.
I mean, because now they've lost the fish, now they're in Norway.
Well, but there's lots of them returning to the area in Russia. And so they want to establish a fishery. And so they did. But in Norway, the big concern is the Atlantic salmon. And these pink salmon are competing with the Atlantic salmon in a way. And they really don't know what to do, right? So it's an invasive species, basically. Kind of like humans, but anyway, they're an invasive species. Yeah.
Is there a map of the temperatures of the ocean, and is there a correlation?
Yeah, good question. And yeah, in fact, they are right now relating the redistribution of pink salmon to sea surface temperature. And temperature does seem to be the limiting factor, if you like. So there's in fact, I'm involved in a paper we're working on right now, which is basically correlating the projected dispersal of pink salmon related to sea surface temperatures. Yeah, Roger?
New Zealand, I mean, and what's in the.
Well, I did my PhD in New Zealand, as you know, right? So, and I worked on quinnet salmon. You probably know what quinnet are, or maybe you're a North Islander. I mean, so quinnet it's the French name, but it's also the common name, or it was 40 years ago for Chinook salmon in New Zealand. And so Chinook have been, they've, salmon have been introduced into the Great Lakes and are doing quite well, pink salmon in particular, but they don't go to the ocean. They were the salmon in New Zealand, the main species is the Chinook, and they were taken from Northern California, somewhere near San Francisco, actually, and then introduced. It was thought that they didn't take because probably most of them migrated down to the ocean and then they're looking for the San Francisco River and they never found it, or maybe they did, but they didn't come back. But a few of them did come back. And so they're now established at Wanaka in the Hawea, near the Hawea River, and in the Clutha and the Waitaki, no, not the Waitako. What was the name of it? Anyway, yeah, a bunch of rivers down on the south. I don't think there's any in the North Island. And there's quite and some of them are anadromous and some of them stay in fresh water. Yeah, so and then they introduced, brown trout, of course, and the galaxids in New Zealand are just gorgeous fish, but they're pretty well all been extirpated by these introduced salmonids. So yeah, it's not really a good news story for native fish, I guess. So this is, people wonder, were there really a lot more salmon back in the good old days? And I mean, these are real pictures. The top one is a purse seine. So with a purse seine, they basically do a big loop with a seine net, and then they close the bottom. And so any fish that are in there, and then they basically tighten it and then lift it up onto the deck. So I've seen them doing purse seines out here, for different species. And it's still very common. And but then this is I can't remember if this is the Lower Fraser or the Skeena, but in the early 1900s they had these major fisheries for salmon in the lower parts of these rivers. And initially they were just using little gill netters that were, the guys were rowing them, and then eventually they got steam engines. They became more and more efficient. And initially they would only use the sockeye and the Chinook salmon, and the rest would just get thrown overboard. But there was a hell of a lot of fish, right? And so the question is, were they really that much more abundant in the good old days? And I guess the answer is it depends where you lived, essentially. So, oh God, I did that again. This is technically too advanced for me, I guess. Either I should put on my glasses so I can see. Oh, you're probably wondering what that pizza is about. Anyway, you'll find this is building the suspense, right? So, anyway, this one colleague and I we were interested in how many salmon are there in the ocean, and so we went back to 1930. Like some of the glasses that I can actually see. Yeah, so this starts in 1925. So it's almost 100 years of data, and we've done it right up till a couple of years ago. And we're only showing pink salmon, so you got years along the bottom from 1925 to about 2020, and you've got millions of salmon on the vertical axis. And that sort of early peak in about 1935 is about 400 million. And about 400 or 500 million. And the highest number, I think, was 2018, we had 900 million. So there's actually, and these are the three most abundant species. So the pink salmon are on the top, sockeye are red, and chum are green, the green bars. And the other species, like the coho and the Chinook and steelhead make up less than 5% of the total numbers. So if I'd put those on there, you just see a black line along the bottom, right? So this is only the 3 most abundant species. But what this tells you is there's actually more salmon out there in the ocean than there ever has been, right? But they're pink salmon and they're chum salmon. And most people around here kind of like the sockeye, which are doing, some of them are doing okay, or the coho or the Chinook, which are relatively unimportant, from a North Pacific Ocean perspective. So, yeah, so actually there are, so what we tell people, and, even most salmon, a lot of salmon biologists, this is new to them. They don't maybe read the literature, I don't know, but they seem surprised when you tell them that there's actually more salmon out there than there's ever been, right? But it's the devil's in the details, right? So, we have in odd numbered years, we'll have maybe 25 million pink salmon in the Fraser. Even numbered years is probably a couple hundred. But people don't tend to fish them, right? And same with the chum, although that's changing a little bit. But so so we're near, like I said before, we're near the southern distribution of these species, and so our numbers, the salmon numbers around here are down, but not when you look at the big picture. And so some of us, whoops, what did I do there? I had to lead into my pizza story. So some of us think that there's so many fish out there that there's what we call density dependent competition, or density dependent effects of competition, which basically means if you were related to a pizza, if we'd ordered a large pizza and, Bev and Emily and I were here first, the large pizza would have been lots for us, right? But if we had that large pizza and we tried to feed this group, a bunch of you would be going hungry, right? So this is what we're saying is essentially is happening in the ocean right now, is that there's a finite amount of food out there, and we're starting to see effects on the growth and the survival of many of our species, including Fraser sockeye. So it's the ocean has changed, it's warmer, and that is having negative effects on the types of plankton that most salmon like to eat. So there's probably less food out there than there used to be. And so we're seeing fish that are growing slower, which means that they may have to spend an extra year in the ocean before they come back to spawn, which exposes them to more mortality. So we're seeing basically, we project that we're going to see a downturn in the North Pacific in the coming decade or so. Okay, so this is kind of where we're at. So what I think I've said, I may have forgotten some of it, but the ocean is getting warmer, but at the same time, there's more salmon out there than there's ever been. And the pizza story, there's the warming ocean and increasing competitors that kind of they kind of interact to reduce the growth and survival. And that tends to benefit the northern populations at the expense of the southern populations. So what we try to do essentially is to maintain life history diversity. And so we want to have lots of different populations, and we want each of the populations to have as much genetic diversity within a population as reasonable. And so some of those critters, in a population, some of them are better adapted for warm water or cold water or early springs or late springs. By having diversity, you're more likely to have individuals that will survive in sort of anomalous conditions. And some of us think there's too many fish being released. So right now, we've estimated that 40% of the biomass of the salmon in the North Pacific Ocean originate from hatcheries, 40%. And Canada is a bit player. So we produce about 8% of the salmon in the North Pacific Ocean. So most of them come from Alaska and Russia and Japan. And we think salmon are the big thing here, but there's a lot more of them out there from other parts of the world.
This. Here. Actually, doesn't look like.
Well, we see a lot of that was written. Well, yeah, well, see, there's differences among species. So the pink salmon are the most numerous, but about 80% of them are wild. The chum salmon is different. So chum salmon are probably almost half of the chum salmon in the ocean are of hatchery origin, and they're bigger and they live in the ocean for longer than the pink salmon. So pink salmon are only in the ocean for, 18 months, actually 6 months. Yeah, 18 months. And whereas chum salmon will be there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, kind of like a Chinook. So so most of them are hatchery origin, and most of them come from Asia, but they coexist with our fish. So it's yeah. So when I'm not trying to bash hatcheries, lamb in a way, but it's not the Canadian hatcheries that are the problem. They're part of the problem, but it's more the industrial size hatcheries of Asia in particular. And chum salmon, because they don't have a freshwater rearing period, they've figured this out. I mean, you don't have to keep your fish in a hatchery for a year. You just hatch the egg and let them, wait a little and just let them go. So I've been in hatcheries systems in Russia, and it's actually their equivalent of the mafia that run most of the hatcheries in Russia, many of them. And these people are really good business people, right? And they've figured it out that they'll have a little stream, I don't know, smaller than cat stream, and they'll catch the adults returning, raise them in a hatchery, release them, and then when they come back, they'll leave a few in the river and they'll catch the rest and sell them, and it's cheap. They make a lot of money. So it's much more economical than longer lived species. So yeah, so it's a concern. Yeah. So I'm going to go through just quickly the different species. Are there any questions online, or do we know? No. Okay.
Try using the space bar too in advance. That might be easier than.
Oh, that might be easier. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm almost done. So but yeah, you told me that. Okay. So this is a really good looking male. And so this is a big Chinook salmon. And like I said, that would be a really handsome face to a female Chinook salmon, right? He's got the big kite. And this guy he's spent, I would imagine. That looks like a seal mark on his side, but it's hard to say. So these are the big guys, and they get a lot of the Chinook will get bigger. I'm sorry, will get red, but not nearly as red as a sockeye. So Chinook are doing really poorly everywhere, right from Alaska down to Northern California, and including BC. And they seem to be susceptible to rising temperatures. And so they are just a bad news story everywhere in the North Pacific. I mean, there's still lots of them there, but and they're also tending to become younger. Like that first picture I showed of that big Chinook, you rarely would see anything like that. There we go. So sockeye. So sockeye are what are regarded around here as the most valuable fish, and they probably are. They are the best best salmon for canning, high quality. And if you get them before they're in the rivers, when they're silver, the flesh is wonderful. It keeps very well. They taste good. And as soon as they hit fresh water, or a little bit before, they turn this bright red. And they're also, I mentioned earlier that each lake has a distinct population, which is genetically separate from other lake populations of sockeye. And so it's a big job to count these. So we have to have all these species. Fisheries and Oceans tries to come up with estimates of how many fish return to spawn. And the sockeye are kind of fun because you do it all by air, helicopter. Well, now they're using drones more and more. But you'll find a big batch of them like this, and you can sort of measure the area and you kind of estimate the numbers, but you don't know how many layers they are, and there'll often be 3 or 4 layers there. So it's, you're kind of, it's difficult to get an accurate estimate. But because they're red, they're easier to count than the other ones. So, and this is a coho, and the coho, and they also can get red. So there you can see another handsome male with the kite, and that's a female in the background. So they can turn red, but not as red as a sockeye. And they're kind of interesting because they're usually a 3-year fish, but they tend to stay relatively close to their stream of origin when they enter the ocean. So most of the Fraser River coho or Vancouver Island coho, well, they used to stay in the strait here, but now it looks like they are more and more. Like the fishery is actually improving within the Strait of Georgia, but they don't migrate long distances usually. So the downside of that is that if they're living in an area like the Salish Sea, where the temperature is increasing and other things are happening in the Salish Sea, they may be spending most of their lives there, whereas other species are going to the Gulf of Alaska. So the coho are more susceptible to climate-related issues than other species, just because of their relatively local marine distribution. Pink salmon, they're actually my favorite. So the picture on the top is pink salmon in the ocean, and most of the salmon in the ocean look like that. People tend to take pictures of them in fresh water because they're easier to see and they're more interesting. And you can tell a pink because he's got these big dots on the tail fin, and a few along the top of the back. And so there again, you've got this really handsome looking male on the bottom there. So you can see how the shape has changed from when he was in the ocean to, I'm not saying it's the same fish, but they get, the common name for pink salmon is a humpy, and it's because of the hump. The males get this big hump. Females don't. And they're not big. They're about this kind of size, right? So, and lots of pink salmon. These are pink salmon in the net pens out here, right? That they just off the lighthouse, I think. Yeah. I think because North Americans are really fussy.
This is.
No, I don't. No, if you get a fresh pink, from the saltwater, before they color up, they're really good. But the flesh, I don't know, but the flesh doesn't seem to last as well. But you can buy pinks at Thrifties there for like $4 or $5, right? Yeah, and if you put enough seasoning on them, they taste pretty good. Yeah, well, I mean, if they're flash frozen at sea, they are quite okay. Like my father was a commercial fisherman, and Linda would never touch a pink salmon, my wife, right? Because she was raised in a family where they eat sockeye and chinook and nothing else. Yeah. Bell first.
Is it because they're fights or an animal or something
Yeah.
fight the other animal?
Well, it's partly because the males are aggressive. That's true. And it's a bit of a joke saying that the females find them attractive. But I think they probably do, right? Because the males, it's the ones that have got the biggest kite. They're sexually dimorphic, right? And you don't get that kind of face, or the hump isn't nearly as big on a female. So yeah. And
I
generally,
was essentially going to ask the same question. So that's basically about competing once they get back into the river.
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a big price to pay.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a particularly handsome fish, that one, right? And you can see like in the lower part, those look like females. They're not nearly, well, actually that's a male on the two on the right are males, and the two in the middle are females. So they don't have nearly the characteristics. Yeah. Yeah, this is so chumps. Okay. Yeah, so chum actually, so I think they are really the climate winners. And so they seem to be doing really well. Thank you very much. And in the ocean, they're silver like all of the others, but then they get these vertical striations when they get in fresh water. And that would be a male in the back, so he's got a bit of a kite, and a female in the front. And yeah, they're the chum and the pink, like I mentioned, people say that they stray more than the other species, and I think that's not right. It's their biology, but so they don't home as precisely as the other species because of their short freshwater duration. And chum, like I mentioned, we caught them in 1977 in the Liard River in BC, right? Well, that's the ones in the Mackenzie come from two origins. One is from Russia, and the other came over from the Yukon River via what they call headwater capture. So they've actually got two different origins for the chum salmon and the Mackenzie. But don't get me talking about that. It'll go on. But anyway, they're doing quite well. Thank you very much, especially in the north. And so I mentioned, yeah, so steelhead. Everybody still calls them a trout, but the steelhead is an ocean-going rainbow trout. So it's the same species as a rainbow trout. They have this beautiful red stripe, most of them along the side, covered with spots. And interestingly, these steelhead go further in the ocean than any of the salmon. I don't know why, but they go further to the west, closer to Asia than any of the other salmon. And they're also very surface oriented. So when they're fishing, commercial fishing for other species, particularly off the Skeena and the Nass, they'll have sinking gill nets so that the float line is about a meter below the surface. And a lot of the steelhead will just be on the surface and they'll miss them. So it's a way of avoiding catching steelhead as bycatch.
Jim, do some of the steelhead just remain in lake?
Yeah, those would be called rainbow trout. Yeah, so there's lots of rainbow trout for sure that don't go to the ocean. Another one I haven't mentioned is kokanee. So kokanee are sockeye salmon that don't go to the ocean. And they may be landlocked, in which case they can't, like the kokanee in Kootenay Lake, for example. Or there's lots of coastal lakes here where it's quite interesting if you're interested in this kind of thing. So you'll have a population of Oncorhynchus nerca, and in times when the marine environment is not favorable, more of them will stay in fresh water, but a few of them always go to the ocean. And then if the ocean turns around and becomes more favorable to the salmon, then the anadromous individuals will do better than the ones that are in fresh water. And so you'll see these shifts within a population. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, that's why I like this stuff. I find it good. Yeah, so here we've got Atlantic salmon. And if you ever want to know how to tell an Atlantic salmon, you look at the gill cover. If it's got spots on the gill flap, the operculum, that's an Atlantic salmon. So that's how you tell an Atlantic salmon. Beautiful fish.
Where is that? The spots that they have?
On the gill flap, like if I can do this, right here. Yeah. So if you buy Atlantic salmon in the grocery store, it should have spots on the gill flap. If it doesn't, you might be buying a pink salmon. You never know. But anyway, all the Atlantic salmon that you buy at the grocery store are from, aquaculture facilities. Yep.
Okay, we saw that big picture, the big salmon,
Yeah.
and then you say that there's smaller ones now. Now, how long do they stay before they go back to do the big ones stay out for
That's-
15 years and the little ones stay
Oh,
out?
that's a good question. Yeah. So within the Chinook or the chum, or even most of the species except for the pink salmon, they'll stay out different lengths of time. So it's a way for a population to mix up its genes, if you like, so that you'll get fish that are that were fry in 2000, the year 2000, for example. They'll go to the ocean in maybe 2001. Some of them will come back in 2003 or 2004 or 2005. So they're mixing up the genes amongst different broods, if you like. So it's a way of increasing the diversity within a population. So the biggest Chinook salmon are older. So they would be maybe 7 years of age, but then some of them are, these are Chinook. The 7 would be the oldest, and 4 or 5 would be kind of the average. Yeah. And I don't think I talked about pink. I want to talk a little bit about, I've shown the pink, I think. No, I haven't. Yeah, I forget where I am. But anyway, the pink salmon, they're 2-year fish. So that means that the ones that spawn in the year 2000, their babies will spawn in 2002, 2004, 2006. The ones that spawn in 2001, they'll spawn 2001, 2003. So you've got genetically isolated brood lines for pink salmon. So that's why in the Fraser, I mentioned you get like 20 million in an odd year and basically none in an even year. And so if you go further north, you get them both in, the odd years and the even years, but they're essentially different species. And they appear to have different glacial histories. So that, like post-glacial, they survive glaciation in different parts of the ocean, and they're genetically isolated. So that's kind of cool. Yeah, Roger?
I'm just wondering, I'm sorry, seal built-in trout, right? That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I go to New Zealand, we have these brown trout. Where the hell do they come from? Because they're again particular species, I think, in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Where do they come from? And do they do the same thing with steelhead or not?
No, I don't think the brown trout there go to sea, but they're from Europe. So the first people that Europeans that came to New Zealand, as you know, they introduced gorse and broom and foxes and stoats and rain and brown trout too, right? So they wanted, yeah.
The salmon that we find washed up on the shores here of our island in
Yeah.
the fall, what type of salmon?
They're pretty well all chum, and they're from the Nanaimo. So they've been washed out of the lower Nanaimo in all probability, and yeah, and they're almost all chum. Yeah, and but it's interesting, because they'll spawn. Chum salmon can spawn intertidally, so some populations the eggs can withstand a bit of salt water, and so I don't know about the Nanaimo, but the chase, there's actually the ones that spawn in the lower river are genetically different than the ones that spawn in the upper river, because the ones in the lower river can tolerate a bit of salt water. But in the ones you see here are from the Nanaimo, and depending on the timing of the spawn and the rainfall, if you get a big flood event, it'll wash more of them out and get more of them on our beaches. And, they're great for the compost, right, Jim? So, yeah, and, it's fish fertilizer, right? So, and they also probably have some beneficial effect on the intertidal community of the ecosystem around here. Yeah. Yep.
Physiological changes take place in the salmon when they go through salt water and fresh water. Are there major changes? What do they adapt to?
Well, because they're not going to live for a long time in fresh water, they don't have to, make many changes, but they essentially stop feeding, and all of their energy is going towards the production of reproductive matter, right? So it's different. It's much more difficult for them when they go from freshwater to the ocean. So because they have to become physiologically able to go from freshwater to the ocean and be able to survive in the salt water.
Changes do take place.
I don't
They
know.
handle the changes.
Well, I mean, their whole physiology has to change as juveniles, right? Because they have to be able to tolerate the ocean. I actually don't know. I'm not a physiologist, so.
But they take longer, don't they, to go into the ocean, most of them. They hang around in brackish water, so they would have time to
And that's true, but it depends a bit on the species. But that's why estuaries are really important, because the estuary is where they hang out, especially the Chinook, right? So like the Nanaimo estuary or any of the estuaries are important. So you tend not to get Chinook salmon in rivers that just kind of dump into the ocean where there's no sort of area for them to adapt. I know with coho, they will live in the, often the young will live in the sort of intertidal area of a river or street creek, and they'll kind of go back and forth for a while before they're physiologically able to tolerate the salt water. And yeah, Jim?
If we have more salmon than we've ever had, why do we have net pens?
Well, it's like, why do you raise cows, right? I mean, it's the net pens are there to provide food and employment, right? Like they're not designed. I mean, there are some in Alaska, you know, there are, instead of hatcheries, they will raise salmon in net pens and then release them. And that happens sometimes, but you know, by and large, it's aquaculture.
Just convenient.
Well, it's providing food and it's cheap or cheaper,
But the food
right?
is there. I mean, it's just out in the water. It's net.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what you're saying.
If there's salmon never.
Right.
It's there.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah, yeah. Well, because not everybody likes to eat chum and pink. That's part of it. And you know, maybe they're not abundant in the area that you live. And it's relatively cheap to raise them in a net pen and then just catch them and, you know, freeze them and cook them, I guess. Yeah. But it's, you know, it's quite controversial, obviously.
Are you brave enough to make comments on fish farming?
If you want me to, yeah. I mean, the thing is, fish farms are, I mean, it's, you have to look at the purpose of them, right? And they provide employment and good food. I mean, I eat farm fish. I mean, if you want to save wild fish, you're probably better to eat the farm fish, right? That's kind of the way I look at it. But I don't think they taste quite as good, but that's personal bias. But you know, there, I mean, fish farms are like a lot of controversial topics. You know, it's depends on you know what your goal is, right? And you know, most of the negative effects of fish farms are exaggerated by the people that don't like fish farms. You know, and most of the effects are fairly local, and they're affecting mostly pink and chum salmon, which are smaller when they go to sea, but they're also the species that return to a broad area of coastline. So they're unlikely to eliminate a population with a fish farm, just because there's, you know, brothers and sisters are the ones that might die from the sea lice or going to other neighboring systems, right? But I think they're like in places like Hawaii, you know, they're starting, not for salmon, but they're starting to use drifting net pens, right? And they just let these big net pens kind of drift around in the ocean, right? And it's out deep, and I think eventually they'll maybe start to do that with salmon. There's no reason why they can't have a drifting net pen off the west coast somewhere with automatic feeders, and you know, be monitoring it with remote cameras or whatever, you know, and then you would get away from the, you know, most of the effects, they're local, and it's because they've got the net pens in shallow near shore areas where there's obviously going to be problems with pollution at the bottom and seals nearby that are going to get in. You know, if they just take them off the west coast and let them float around for a while, like, you know, I think, but it's going to be more expensive. And the other thing they're doing, of course, is they're moving them onto land. And so there's Campbell River, there was one in Nanaimo. I don't know if it's still in operation, but so if they move the net pen up onto land and then either circulate the water or filter it somehow, you know, they can get away from a lot of the problems in the ocean. But that means your fish are going to be a little more expensive, right?
Is feed an issue too, though?
Which is that?
Isn't feed source an issue too?
Yeah, and the feed source, yeah. I mean, you're basically depending where at what, usually for the feed, they're getting it from euphausiids and, shrimp in the ocean. So basically they're catching, other organisms to feed the salmon, which are further up on the food chain. So you're right. A lot of the euphausiids and things that are used for fish food for net pens come from the Antarctic and southern hemisphere. So there's definitely negative effects of fish farms on, the ecosystem way to the south or wherever they get it. But they're working on other types of food, so I think there's ways around that. Yeah. So all right, we're nearing the end here, I think. What is it, 10:52? Oh, not too bad. Space bar, she says. All right, so there's just some interesting sort of facts. At least I think they're interesting. So here's your question. What species have we got there? Those are sockeye. And what about this guy on the bottom? You see that guy? No, it's a char. So it's either a dolly varden or a bull trout. And so it's not a salmon, but you'll quite often get these guys in freshwater and they just love salmon eggs, right? So he's just hanging out there waiting for these guys to spawn and he'll just gobble up as many eggs as he can, right? So kind of interesting. And they migrate, the sockeye, they'll migrate right up the river, on the edge of the river, right, to keep out of the current as much as they can. And so we got two types of orcas that we know about, and I think we've had talks on this at some point. So you've got the residents, which are fish eaters, and they mostly like Chinook. And there's about 300 of them out there. So if you do the arithmetic, and I assume that they live for 135 days in the Saley Sea, so they'll eat about 1,000 tons of Chinook salmon per year. That's quite a bit. So it's about 100 1-ton trucks kind of thing. But then of course we've got the big whales or the transients, which are the ones that these boats are taking people out to sea here, and they don't eat fish; they eat marine mammals. So they don't bother the salmon. And then they've got, I read they're finding other species of orcas, and there goes the fast ferry. So approximately 80% of the farm fish in BC are from Atlantic salmon, not Pacific salmon. And I kind of explained that the Atlantic salmon are the original Atlantic salmon that were brought to BC from Norway or Scotland were kind of like our cows, right? They were easy, they survived well in crowded conditions, right? And so then I've mentioned this already. It's kind of cool that the Pacific and the Atlantic salmon have different numbers of chromosomes. So that's a fundamental difference in species, the numbers of chromosomes. Yeah, so we're just sort of wrapping up. So it's we've got lots of different issues with facing our salmon, but we're fortunate that we've got as many as we do, and particularly in places like Nanaimo, that you can actually, if you know where to go, you can actually see them and potentially catch them and cook them. There's lots of natural predators. Now these pictures I got off the web, and you kind of wonder whether this has been photoshopped or whatever. So that's a grizzly. You can tell a grizzly by the hump, right, on the back. That's and then you may have seen this picture. This is quite common, and it's you have to give it's like Chris McLennan took this picture, so maybe it's legitimate or maybe he just kind of photoshopped it. But when I look at that poor salmon, he looks kind of scared. Yeah. So I kind of think maybe that is a real picture, but. What's that? Yeah. So one thing I haven't talked about is I don't think anyway, is the role of salmon in the terrestrial food chain and the freshwater food chain. So when you think of salmon, they go to the ocean and they're about this big, and then they come back and they're this big. So all of that meat, all that flesh that the salmon have put on is all marine derived nutrients, right? So it's basically a way of transporting fertilizer from the ocean to fresh water. And you can identify marine origin materials based on a different isotope, right? So that it's different than in fresh water. So they can actually track the movement or the importance of marine derived nutrients through the terrestrial ecosystem, and so bears will haul them back in the bush, or bears will eat them in the river and then defecate back in the bush, and then that fertilizer is being used to grow the trees and feed all sorts of other organisms. So so they have an important role there. One thing we don't know much about is fires. So we think of the fires we've had in the last couple of years, right? And the changes that that's having in terms of the hydrology and nutrients and sediment that are going into streams. So we don't really have a good understanding of that. So this is a mining town originally, right? So they used to take canaries down in the mine shaft just under here, and to see if there's a problem with the air. Well, we sometimes think of salmon as the canary in the global coal mine. And that's it. So thank you.